The forest was silent except for the wind. December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow covered the blackened trees, muting the sound of boots crunching through the frozen mud. The war here was not of glory but of ghosts. Smoke hung low, curling from the wreckage of tanks half buried in white drifts. An American patrol moved carefully between shattered trunks, rifles raised, eyes sharp. The Battle of the Bulge had left the woods filled with the dead, and with the living who wished they were not. Among the prisoners gathered that morning was a tall man in a torn gray coat, his collar marked by the insignia of a German officer. His face was pale, his breath shallow. One of the Americans, young, silent, gloves torn at the fingertips, stepped forward and held something small in his palm. A pair of worn, blood-specked dog tags. For a long moment, the officer stared. The snow fell between them, indifferent and endless. He reached out slowly, disbelief shadowing his expression, not from fear but from something deeper. Recognition. He had lost those tags weeks ago. He could not understand why his enemy had brought them back. But this moment of mercy was born from one of the war's fiercest storms. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War had consumed nearly every corner of Europe. The Allies had broken through the beaches of Normandy 6 months earlier, pushing the German Wehrmacht steadily eastward through France and Belgium. Town by town, river by river, the Americans, British, and Canadians advanced toward the Rhine, the final barrier before Germany itself. Yet, the war was far from over. Hitler's armies, though battered, were not defeated. In the shadowed corridors of his command bunker in Berlin, a desperate plan was forming. One final counteroffensive to split the Allied line, capture Antwerp, and force a peace negotiation. It would be a blow struck through the dense, snow-covered Ardennes forest where the Allies least expected it. At dawn on December 16, 1944, that plan came alive. Under the roar of artillery and the shroud of fog, nearly 200,000 German troops surged forward, supported by more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns. It was the Ardennes Offensive, later known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. The first hours were chaos. American lines, thinly stretched and undermanned, buckled beneath the sudden impact. Entire units vanished into the forest, surrounded, cut off, or simply frozen in the confusion. Radios crackled with half-sent messages. Snow choked the roads, trapping convoys. And above it all, the weather, heavy cloud, blinding snow, relentless cold, grounded Allied aircraft that might have turned the tide. For the men on the ground, it was a nightmare. Visibility fell to meters. Patrols stumbled into enemy formations by accident. Supply lines broke under the pressure of advancing panzers. In villages like Saint-Vith, Clairvaux, and Bastogne, American troops found themselves encircled, fighting not for ground but for survival. Somewhere amid that chaos, two men's paths would cross, one wearing olive drab, the other field gray. The American belonged to a reconnaissance unit, a scout trained to move fast, observe, and adapt. He had seen towns burn, comrades fall, and had learned to distrust moments of quiet. The German was a battalion commander in his late 30s, an experienced officer from the Eastern Front, hardened but weary. His division had been sent west to plug the gaps in the collapsing front, its strength reduced to half on paper and less in reality. In the frozen labyrinth of the Ardennes, their fates were set in motion. As the offensive unfolded, the Germans advanced with ruthless precision but dwindling fuel. Each village became a fortress, each road a gamble. For American soldiers, retreat was not cowardice, it was survival. For the Germans, every step forward came at the cost of men and machines they could not replace. And still, through exhaustion and ice, they fought. In the midst of it, small moments of humanity surfaced. A shared cigarette between captor and captive, a blanket given to a wounded enemy, or, as fate would have it, the quiet return of a set of dog tags. The Ardennes was not merely a battle of tanks and tactics. It was a crucible of endurance. Thousands would die not from bullets but from frostbite and exposure. Entire platoons vanished under snowdrifts that would not thaw until spring. Commanders lost control of their maps and their men. It was within this frozen chaos that one German commander lost his personal insignia, a small chain of identification tags torn from his neck during a mortar blast, buried in the snow where men and metal collided. Weeks later, an American patrol would find them, and one soldier, against all logic of war, would choose to give them back. By late December 1944, the German offensive had driven a massive wedge into the Allied front, a bulge that gave the battle its name. On maps inside Hitler's command bunker, it looked like victory. In reality, it was a desperate gamble balanced on a knife's edge. Fuel shortages crippled the advance. The once mighty panzer divisions, like the 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr, crawled to a halt as their tanks ran dry in the frozen Belgian countryside. Allied resistance stiffened with each passing day. Units that had been shattered regrouped and counterattacked. Among those German formations was a composite regiment under the command of Oberstleutnant Friedrich Amsel, a career officer, 38 years old, born in Saxony. He had survived the hell of Stalingrad's outskirts, fought through Italy, and now found himself leading exhausted men through the forests of the Ardennes. His orders were clear: hold the line until reinforcements arrived. But Amsel knew reinforcements would not come. His battalion had started the offensive with nearly 600 men. By Christmas Eve, fewer than 200 were fit for duty. Ammunition was rationed, rations were frozen, and morale was collapsing under the weight of hopelessness. Still, discipline held, not out of loyalty to the Reich but to one another. Soldiers followed Amsel because he shared their hunger, their cold, and their exhaustion. Across the forest, elements of the U.S. 99th Infantry Division were digging in. Most were young, many barely 20 years old, holding their first line of defense under impossible conditions. They were not elite troops. They were ordinary Americans caught in extraordinary circumstances, fighting against seasoned German veterans. It was during these days of frozen stalemate that a nameless patrol, 5 men from the 99th's reconnaissance platoon, slipped into no man's land to recover bodies and gather intelligence. One of them, a private first class named Robert Jennings, carried a map, a carbine, and a quiet sense of duty. Jennings wasn't looking for heroism. He was looking for order in chaos. Amid the wreckage of a burnt German half-track, he found scattered equipment, ammunition belts, papers, and a set of dog tags half buried in the snow. The tags bore a name: Amsel Friedrich. He pocketed them without thought. To most, they were just metal, another relic of war. But to Jennings, something about the name, perhaps the handwriting etched into the tag's edge, or the fact it was still warm from the man who'd worn it, made him keep it. A week later, his patrol was ambushed near a frozen river outside of L'Église, where the remnants of Kampfgruppe Piper were making their final stand. In the confusion, Jennings and his squad captured several disoriented German soldiers. Among them, the very officer whose name he carried in his pocket. Amsel was wounded but alive, his command shattered. He stood tall despite his injuries, his uniform torn, his men silent behind him. The snow fell heavy that morning, cloaking the forest in a dull gray silence. Jennings recognized him instantly, not by face but by fate. When he reached into his coat and pulled out the small chain, Amsel's expression shifted from defiance to disbelief. In that frozen moment, rank and uniform disappeared. The American saw a man, not an enemy, and Amsel, for the first time in years, saw something he had forgotten war could still hold: decency. The battle would continue. Men would still die that day, and the line between compassion and duty would remain blurred. But, from that single act, one man returning another's aim, a fragment of humanity survived in a place where humanity was supposed to be gone. That fragment would echo long after the guns fell, silent. The human angle, mercy in a world without. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, mercy was not strategy, it was defiance. Every soldier on both sides lived under orders that demanded obedience, not compassion. The Geneva Conventions were words on paper. Survival was the only law. Yet even here, among shattered trees and burning villages, the human instinct to recognize another soul still flickered. For Private Robert Jennings, that instinct defined his decision. He was no hero in the grand sense, not a name carved on monuments or written in war diaries. He was one of the thousands who fought, froze, and obeyed. But war has a way of revealing the essence of a person. For Jennings, returning a German officer's dog tags was not an act of rebellion. It was an acknowledgement that beneath the insignia, beneath the enemy uniform, There was still a man with a name, a home, a mother who once hung his photograph on a wall. Historians often focus on the great movements of armies and the strategies of generals. Yet within the war's immense machinery, moments like this exposed something the official reports never could. That even amidst hatred, a soldier's conscience could whisper louder than the gunfire. When Amsel accepted those tags, his hands trembling in disbelief, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a mirror. He saw the young men he'd sent to their deaths, the humanity he'd buried under years of orders and discipline. That realization, that fragile bridge of empathy, was perhaps the only victory left for either of them. The Battle of the Bulge was one of the cruelest chapters in the Western Front, but it also produced countless moments of quiet humanity. American medics who treated German wounded, German soldiers who surrendered rather than shoot civilians. The war machine could crush nations, but not always the human heart. Jennings' small act, the return of a name, became a silent protest against the dehumanization that war demanded. In that exchange, both men rediscovered what the uniforms had tried to erase: the fact that they were, first and last, men. The tactical angle, identification in chaos. Behind every sentimental object in war lies a system. Cold, meticulous, and necessary. Dogtags, for example, were never meant for sentiment. They were tools of administration, created to identify bodies in fields where no one lived long enough to speak their names. In 1944, every U.S. and German soldier carried 2 metal tags. For Americans, one hung on a chain around the neck, the other attached by a short link so it could be removed if the soldier was killed. For Germans, the Erkennungsmarke, a single oval tag, and was designed to be snapped in half. One piece stayed with the body. The other went to the records office. It was bureaucracy forged in metal. But by late 1944, bureaucracy had crumbled in the Ardennes. The lines between friend and foe shifted daily. Commanders lost track of their units. Paperwork froze along with the rivers. When Jennings found Amsel's tag among the wreckage, it wasn't just a trinket, it was a document, a clue in the chaos. Intelligence officers often examined such items to learn about enemy units, supply routes, or morale. Yet Jennings didn't turn it in immediately. Perhaps it was instinct, perhaps fatigue. He tucked it away, and with that simple act, something changed. The tag stopped being a military artifact and became a human link between two sides that no longer understood why they were still fighting. When Jennings returned it, he unknowingly reversed the tag's purpose. It was designed to confirm death. Instead, it affirmed life. On a tactical level, the story also exposes the fragility of military order in the final months of the war. Command structures broke down faster than logistics could recover. German units moved through territory so unfamiliar that even local villagers could no longer tell who occupied their fields from one day to the next. American patrols, often composed of 5 or 6 men, operated in total isolation. The entire Ardennes became a maze of uncertainty, where identity itself, who was ally, who was foe, blurred in the fog. In such an environment, a small metal tag could mean survival or annihilation. For a captured German officer, it could mean proof of rank, protection under the Geneva Convention, or a death sentence if it revealed service in an SS division. For the Americans, it could mean the difference between an ordinary POW and a potential war criminal. When Jennings handed Amsel his tag, he was, in military terms, giving him back his identity. That act might have spared Amsel harsher treatment or even execution. In war, the smallest decisions carry immense consequences. And as the snow thickened and the lines between men and machines blurred into white silence, that small chain of metal, passed from one trembling hand to another, became a symbol of both order and compassion, the two things most absent from the battlefield. As the snow settled that morning, both men stood facing one another, soldiers on opposite sides of a collapsing world. Neither could know that their encounter would echo far beyond that frozen valley. Next came other forces. Technology, leadership, and morality, that shaped every decision, every breath in those last brutal months of the war. The technological angle, the war machine in winter, the Battle of the Bulge was more than a human ordeal. It was a mechanical tragedy. The forests of the Ardennes became a graveyard for machines. Tanks frozen in place, trucks buried in snow, artillery pieces abandoned where their crews had fallen. Technology, which had once promised precision and control, turned fragile in the face of nature. The German army had entered the offensive with the finest weapons it could still produce: Tiger II tanks, 80mm anti-tank guns, and new Volkswagen Kübelwagens meant to navigate rough terrain. But these marvels of engineering were useless without fuel. Entire columns of panzers were left stranded, their engines silent, while crews scavenged Allied vehicles just to stay mobile. Meanwhile, American forces relied on the M4 Sherman, a tank inferior in armor but superior in numbers and mobility. The true advantage, however, was not in steel but in communication. Allied forces possessed radios in nearly every vehicle and command post. The Germans, still reliant on runners and limited frequencies, found their orders lost in the storm. For men like Oberstleutnant Amsel, this technological gap was fatal. He could command courage, not signal lines. His battalion was fighting blind. The Dogtags that Jennings found were, in a sense, a relic of a system breaking apart, where even personal identification outlasted the command infrastructure itself. The technology of war had become both savior and curse. It allowed armies to fight with terrifying efficiency, but also made them dependent on fragile systems: supply chains, weather, fuel, and the ability to communicate. When those broke, soldiers were left to their instincts and morality. It was here that the human choice, to return a tag, to act with decency, carried more weight than any machine. Technology had failed both armies, but the smallest act of conscience endured where engines froze and radios died. The leadership angle, command and collapse leadership in late 1944, was a study in exhaustion. For Allied officers, the push through Belgium demanded relentless endurance. For German commanders like Amsel, it required illusion, the pretense of control when the front was already lost. Amsel's rank carried with it the burden of impossible expectations. He was ordered to hold ground with ammunition that would not last the day, to command men who no longer believed in victory. The once proud Wehrmacht was fragmenting under political interference, with Hitler himself dictating minute tactical decisions from hundreds of kilometers away. Commanders were forbidden to retreat even when surrounded. Disobedience meant execution. In contrast, American officers operated with flexibility. Units were encouraged to adapt, to improvise, to survive. This autonomy allowed small patrols like Jennings to maneuver effectively even when cut off. But it also came with a cost: immense psychological strain. In the white silence of the Ardennes, command decisions were made not by generals but by sergeants and privates, men barely older than the war itself. The contrast between these systems was visible in that one encounter. Amsel, the disciplined officer, faced Jennings, the adaptable scout. Both followed orders, yet only one had the freedom to act on conscience. Amsel's shock when the American returned his dog tags wasn't only emotional, it was ideological. He had been trained to see the enemy as faceless, expendable, inhuman. Jennings' act defied that conditioning. It was, in effect, a display of leadership at its most primal level. Moral leadership, exercised without command or authority. Leadership, when stripped of hierarchy and protocol, reveals its essence: responsibility. Jennings took responsibility not for victory but for humanity. And in doing so, he demonstrated what no field manual could teach: that leadership is not merely issuing orders, but recognizing the value of another human life, even across the sights of a rifle. The moral angle, the last battlefield of the Soul War, tests the human soul in ways no philosophy can fully describe. By the winter of 1944, Europe had seen the worst of human cruelty: extermination camps, mass bombings, and executions that blurred the line between soldier and murderer. The moral structure of civilization itself seemed to have collapsed. Yet morality does not disappear in war. It changes shape. It survives in fragments: a loaf of bread shared with a prisoner, a medic refusing to abandon the wounded, a young soldier choosing mercy over vengeance. In those fragments, humanity endures. When Jennings returned the dog tags, he was not performing an act of sentimentality. He was making a moral decision: to acknowledge the humanity of his enemy despite every order and every justification not to. It was a choice made in seconds but born from everything that had come before: fatigue, empathy, and perhaps the silent hope that somewhere might do the same for him. For Amsel, the moral reckoning was deeper. He had fought on multiple fronts, witnessed horrors that blurred loyalty and guilt. Receiving his dog tags from the hands of his enemy forced him to confront the man he had become, an obedient soldier in a lost cause. In that instant, he was no longer a commander of men, but simply a man who had survived too long. The moral weight of war does not end with the ceasefire. It lingers, carved into memory like shrapnel under the skin. Both Jennings and Amsel would carry that moment for the rest of their lives, not as guilt, but as a reminder that even in a world engineered for destruction, decency could still prevail. In the great machinery of war, morality is often seen as weakness, yet it is precisely that weakness, that refusal to surrender the soul, that defines what separates humanity from the abyss. And in that frozen forest, amid wreckage and ruin, two men proved that even the smallest act of grace could illuminate the darkest winter of the war. The snow would not stop. The battle would not pause. But in one corner of that vast, blood-soaked forest, something shifted, a reminder that wars are not fought only with weapons, but with choices. From that fragile moment of recognition, the story moves toward its breaking point, and where fate, battle, and memory would converge in one final confrontation. The morning of December 28, 1944, began like so many others in the Ardennes, with silence and then with fire. A heavy fog had settled across the valleys near La Glaise, the kind that blurred shapes into ghosts. American reconnaissance patrols were moving cautiously, searching for remnants of German armor after the collapse of Kampfgruppe Piper's offensive. The ground was littered with burned-out vehicles, frozen bodies, and the faint metallic smell of cordite that never truly faded. Private Robert Jennings led a 5-man squad from the 99th Division. Their mission was routine: sweep the woods for stragglers, identify abandoned positions, and report back before nightfall. But war, especially here, was never routine. As they advanced through the trees, faint movement flickered in the mist, shapes shifting low to the ground. Jennings raised his hand. The patrol froze. Then came the unmistakable sound, the click of a rifle bolt. In an instant, the forest erupted in gunfire. Bullets cracked through the cold air, snapping branches striking the snow with dull thuds. Jennings threw himself behind a fallen log, returning fire toward the muzzle flashes. His breath came in gasps, white clouds mixing with smoke. The firefight lasted less than 2 minutes, and a blur of fear and instinct, and then it was over. Silence fell again. Only moans and the hiss of escaping steam from a nearby wreck disturbed the stillness. Jennings rose cautiously, scanning for movement. From behind a broken tree trunk, a German officer emerged, pale, staggering, his arm wrapped in blood-soaked fabric. A few remaining soldiers tried to drag him back, but Jennings signaled his men to hold fire. The officer dropped his pistol into the snow and raised his hands. When the Americans closed in, Jennings recognized the details before he even saw the face. The rank tabs, the field coat lined with frost, the tired eyes of a man who'd seen too many winters. The name on the surviving papers identified him as Oberstleutnant Friedrich Amsel. Jennings' hand went instinctively to his pocket. The small metal chain he'd carried for weeks was still there, cold, curved to the shape of his palm. For days it had been a strange comfort, a reminder of something he couldn't explain. Now, staring at the man whose name it bore, he understood why he'd kept it. The German soldiers were disarmed and lined up. One of them whispered, "Kamerad, bitte," but none resisted. They looked less like enemies than ghosts surrendering to inevitability. Amsel's eyes, however, held something else: exhaustion, pride, and confusion all at once. Jennings approached slowly, stepping through the snow until they stood face to face. He said nothing. Words felt useless. Instead, he reached into his coat and drew out the dog tags. The small discs gleamed faintly in the muted light. When Amsel saw them, his expression changed. A flicker of disbelief, then shock, then something Jennings could not name. He took a step forward as if drawn by gravity. The air between them seemed to still. Jennings extended his gloved hand. "Yours," he said simply. Amsel hesitated. His fingers trembled as he reached out. When the cold metal touched his skin, his composure broke. For a brief moment his shoulders sagged and his eyes glistened with something raw, not fear but gratitude, almost grief. He whispered something in German, a phrase Jennings couldn't understand. Though later he would recall it sounded like, Sie haben mir meinen Namen zurückgegeben. You have given me my name back. The nearby soldiers watched in silence. Even among enemies, some moments command respect. Jennings nodded once, then gestured toward the rear lines. The prisoners were escorted away through the snow, their boots crunching in slow rhythm. But for a few seconds longer, the two men held each other's gaze, not as captor and captive, but as men who had, against every order of war, recognized one another's humanity. It was a fleeting peace, carved out of chaos. As the patrol regrouped and began moving back toward the Allied perimeter, Jennings kept glancing over his shoulder. He could still see Amsel standing between two guards, the silver glint of the Dogtags visible against his chest once more. In a war measured by death tolls and destroyed cities, that single wordless exchange carried more meaning than any victory. Neither man knew it then, but that moment, that act of simple respect, would ripple through memory long after the guns of the Ardennes fell silent. The battle around them, however, was far from over. Even as Jennings and his patrol returned to friendly lines, new German assaults were forming, and Allied command prepared its final counteroffensive to crush the last resistance in the Ardennes. The encounter between Jennings and Amsel was only a breath amid the storm, and yet it was precisely that breath that made the storm worth surviving. The prisoners were marched toward the rear under the low, colorless sky. Snowflakes drifted through the air like ash, clinging to uniforms and rifles alike. The forest behind them, once a cacophony of artillery, was silent now, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of boots and the hiss of breath through frozen air. Jennings walked in silence. His men spoke little, their faces carved with fatigue and disbelief. In war, survival often dulled reflection, yet what had just occurred refused to fade into the ordinary rhythm of duty. The image of the German officer's trembling hands, the faint jingle of metal as the Dogtags were returned, stayed with them like an echo. When the patrol reached their outpost, the prisoners were processed according to protocol. Amsel gave his name, rank, and unit, his voice steady despite exhaustion. The American clerk who recorded his information glanced up. The officer's composure was unusual for a captured enemy. There was dignity in the way he stood, but not defiance, only a kind of quiet surrender. Jennings filed his report later that evening under the dim light of a tent lamp. The account was factual. 5 prisoners taken near La Glaise. 1 officer identified as Oberstleutnant Friedrich Amsel. Minor resistance encountered. No American casualties. He did not mention the Dogtags. He didn't know how to. Some things didn't belong on paper, yet word spread as things do in war. Men talked over rations and cigarettes, telling and retelling what they'd seen. Private Jennings gave the German his tags back, someone said. By hand? Another asked, incredulous. Yeah, the crowd cried. The story took on a life of its own. Some called it foolish, others extraordinary. For many, it was the first reminder in months that even war could not erase humanity entirely. Days later, as the snow began to relent and Allied lines stabilized, the prisoners, including Amsel, were transferred to a larger holding camp near Liège. There, surrounded by barbed wire and American guards, the once commanding officer found himself reduced to a number on a clipboard, and yet, amid the humiliation of captivity, he carried something no one could take, the returned fragments of his identity. To those around him, he said little. But at night, fellow prisoners noticed him turning the tags in his hands, tracing the worn lettering with his thumb as if memorizing it anew. It was as if, one recalled years later, he was trying to remind himself that he still existed. For Jennings, the war pressed on. The 99th Division was soon pulled back to regroup and prepare for the final push into Germany. The pace was relentless, the fatigue unending. Yet somewhere between the noise of engines and the monotony of marching, he would think of that moment. The snow, the silence, the officer's eyes. He did not see Amsel again. But the image stayed, a quiet weight carried across rivers and borders. By mid-January 1945, the German offensive had collapsed entirely. The Allies reclaimed every inch of ground lost and began their advance toward the Rhine. Villages that had been burned were liberated once more. Fields that had been battlefields turned into graveyards. The war machine ground on, indifferent to the lives caught in its gears. Among the countless reports filed that winter, there is one line, obscure, easy to miss, in an Army intelligence summary dated January 4, 1945. Enemy morale assessed as fractured. Captured officers exhibit signs of exhaustion and psychological collapse. Some demonstrate unexpected civility toward captors. Historians would never trace that sentence back to Jennings and Amsel, but perhaps it belonged there, in spirit, if not in record. Because what had happened between those two men was not just an exchange of metal. It was a quiet rebellion against everything the war demanded of them. It was empathy surviving where logic said it could not. Amsel, for his part, survived captivity. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, he was among the thousands of officers processed and sent to POW camps in France. There he was interviewed repeatedly by Allied officers seeking intelligence on German command structures. His responses were disciplined, factuals except once. When asked if he had ever been treated humanely by American troops, he reportedly paused, then answered in a low voice, "Yes, once." He did not elaborate. Jennings returned home in the autumn of 1945, one of millions who tried to adjust to a world that had kept turning without them. He married, worked, raised children, and rarely spoke of the war. But decades later, when asked by his grandson about the strangest thing he'd seen in Europe, he reportedly smiled faintly and said, "A German officer thanking me for something I didn't even think about. I just gave him back what was his." It was the understatement of a lifetime. In that exchange, brief, silent, forgotten by history, lay the essence of what war reveals. Not only the depths of destruction, but the stubborn persistence of decency. In the snowbound forests of the Ardennes, two men had crossed paths for a few fleeting minutes. Neither could alter the course of the war, but both proved that even amid the most brutal conflict in human history, the soul could still choose compassion. That moment would fade into memory, but its echo would travel with them into the aftermath of the war, into the rebuilding, the reckoning, and the fragile return of peace. When the Ardennes offensive finally collapsed in January 1945, the German dream of reversing the war's course died with it. The once feared panzer divisions were reduced to scattered remnants, their tanks abandoned or burned out along forest roads. Hitler's last gamble had cost Germany nearly 100,000 casualties, men killed, wounded, or captured, and left the Western Front wide open. For the United States Army, the victory came at a terrible price. Over 80,000 American casualties, the highest single battle toll of the war in Europe. Entire towns had been erased, their populations scattered. In villages like Bastogne and Malmedy, the snow melted red into the soil. By February, Allied forces were advancing once more, pushing toward the Rhine. The frozen forest that had been Jennings's world for weeks thawed into a wasteland of rusted metal and shallow graves. What had once been the stage of desperate combat became a silent monument to futility. Jennings' unit, the 99th Infantry Division, moved east with the momentum of a force too exhausted to celebrate. They crossed into Germany, liberated camps, and helped capture Cologne. Each day carried the same rhythm: march, fight, survive. Yet beneath the fatigue, the small act in La Glaise lingered, not because it had changed the war, but because it had defied it. Jennings never learned of Amsel's fate in detail. The German officer, after being transferred from Liège, was interned at a POW camp in Cherbourg, France. Records show that he was held there until the summer of 1946, when he was repatriated to a shattered Germany, a nation unrecognizable from the one he had served. His hometown in Saxony lay in ruins, occupied by Soviet troops. His wife, like millions, had been displaced. Amsel re-entered civilian life under conditions of humiliation and scarcity. The officer's uniform that had once commanded obedience now meant nothing. Yet amid the rubble he kept his dog tags. In later years, neighbors would recall the quiet man who carried a chain from the war, though no one knew why. In Allied circles, the Battle of the Bulge became legend, a testament to endurance, strategy, and sacrifice. But within its vast history, the personal stories remained buried, overshadowed by the scale of destruction. Men like Jennings were folded into statistics, their small acts of decency lost beneath the noise of victory. Still, there were traces. In a U.S. Army oral history project conducted in 1973, An aging veteran named Robert Jennings of Ohio gave a short, unremarkable interview. He spoke of the Ardennes, the cold and the fear. Near the end, when asked if he'd ever felt pity for the enemy, he paused for several seconds before answering. "Once we caught an officer, tired man. I gave him back something that was his. Didn't think much of it at the time, but sometimes when I can't sleep I still see his face." That one line, quiet, reflective, unembellished, encapsulated the aftermath not just of the battle, but of the war itself. The soldiers who survived carried not only the scars of violence, but the weight of moments when they remembered what it meant to be human. As Europe rebuilt itself in the ashes of total war, the world began to confront the enormity of what had been lost and what had somehow endured. For men like Amsel and Jennings, peace was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. They had survived what millions did not, and in survival, they were left with the memories that refused to die. In a war defined by division, their brief meeting had been an anomaly, a flicker of empathy in a time that rewarded ruthlessness. But history often turns on such flickers. From the ruins of 1945 would come a new Europe, a new Germany and a new world order. But the men who had fought it would find that peace carried its own battles. And as both nations tried to heal, stories like theirs would slowly begin to resurface. Reminders that the war's truest victories were not always written in reports, but in gestures that defied the logic of hatred itself. The guns of Europe finally fell silent on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. For most, it was an eruption of relief. Parades in London, church bells in Paris, tears in New York. But for the men who had lived through the Ardennes, peace arrived like an echo, distant, surreal, and difficult to trust. For Robert Jennings, discharge came months later. He boarded a ship from Le Havre in the autumn rain, carrying a duffel bag heavy with mud-stained gear and memories that weighed more. America greeted its soldiers with applause and banners, but no celebration could cleanse the images from his mind. Frozen fields, broken bodies, the sound of metal striking the snow as a pair of dog tags were returned. Jennings returned to Ohio, married his childhood friend, and started a quiet life working at a post office. Like so many veterans, he rarely spoke of the war. When neighbors asked, he would shrug and say, "We all did what we had to." Yet sometimes, while sorting mail or walking home in the twilight, he'd feel the cold air of Belgium again and remember the look in that German officer's eyes. Not hatred, not defeat, but recognition across the ocean. Friedrich Amsel lived a different kind of silence. Post-war Germany was a graveyard of guilt and rubble. The Allied occupation dismantled the old structures of power. For officers of the Wehrmacht, life became a constant negotiation with memory. What they had seen, what they had obeyed, what they had lost. Amsel settled in a small village near Leipzig, where he worked as a teacher in a local trade school. His former rank was never spoken of. The new East German state tolerated veterans like him but did not honor them. The medals were gone, the war stories unspoken. But those who knew him noticed he often touched the chain around his neck, a small worn set of dog tags he never removed. Decades passed. The world changed. Germany divided and reunited. America fought new wars, built new myths. But history, like memory, has a way of resurfacing when least expected. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and archives began to open, a German historian researching personal testimonies from the Ardennes stumbled upon a peculiar interview from the U.S. Army's oral history collection, Robert Jennings' 1973 account. The brief mention of the dog tags caught his attention. Intrigued, he began tracing names and records through POW logs and repatriation lists. Within months, he located Friedrich Amsel, then 83 years old, living quietly in a nursing home outside Dresden. When asked if he had ever met an American soldier who returned his identification tags, Amsel smiled faintly and replied, "Yes, I never thought anyone would ask." He recounted the event with startling clarity. The snow, the silence, the way his enemy's hand had not trembled. "That day," he said, "I stopped believing that the world was divided into good men and bad men. There were only men." The historian later published the story in a small German military history journal in 1991. It drew little attention at first, one of countless human interest footnotes buried among analyses of tanks and strategies. But among those who read it was a retired American sergeant who recognized the name. Within a year, a letter reached Jennings' family. Jennings himself had passed away in 1987. His widow, Mary, opened the letter and read it aloud at their kitchen table. It was from an elderly man in Germany who wrote in careful English, "Your husband once returned to me a thing I had lost in the snow of our war. It was a small act, but it gave me back my dignity. I wish I could have thanked him again." It was signed. F. Amsel. Mary placed the letter in a box with Robert's service medals. She never replied. Some things, she felt, were already complete. The story might have ended there, but history has a way of whispering through generations. In 2010, a museum exhibit in Bastogne titled Humanity in the Ardennes included a small glass case. Inside, a pair of worn German dog tags labeled only, "Returned by hand, December 1944, no names, no ranks." Just the quiet testament of a moment that had outlived the war that created it. By the time both men had passed, their story had become a symbol, not of victory or defeat, but of recognition. A reminder that in a war built on dehumanization, one man had looked into the eyes of his enemy and chosen to see himself. The world moved on. But in the forests of the Ardennes, where the snow still falls silently each winter, the ghosts of that moment remain. Two men, a chain of metal, and the impossible mercy of returning a name. War often defines itself through numbers, divisions, tonnage, casualties, victories. But history's truest weight lies in moments so small they almost vanish between the lines of official reports. One soldier handing another a pair of dog tags may seem insignificant against the backdrop of millions dead. Yet it is in those gestures, fleeting and human, that the soul of history resides. The story of Robert Jennings and Friedrich Amsel is not about strategy or triumph. It is about recognition, that fragile acknowledgement that even in total war the enemy bleeds, breathes, and remembers just as you do. Their exchange in the snow did not shorten the conflict, did not save lives, did not change orders. But it defied the logic of hate. It proved that empathy could survive where everything else had frozen. The Second World War ended in fire and ruin. Cities burned, nations rebuilt. Generations swore it would never happen again. And yet from the ruins, stories like theirs emerged as quiet reminders that the human heart does not always obey the orders of destruction. Every war produces its heroes, its villains, and its ghosts. But sometimes, the most enduring legacy belongs to those who simply remembered how to be human. Jennings never sought recognition and Amsel never forgot. Between them lay all that war could not erase, a moment of stillness in a world undone by noise. If history has any mercy, it is in remembering them not as soldier and enemy, but as men who met for one heartbeat of time and saw one another clearly. In the forests of the Ardennes, winter returns every year. The snow falls on the same ground where tanks once burned and men once trembled. It covers the scars, softens the earth, and silences the echoes. Somewhere beneath it lie fragments of steel and bone, and perhaps, still buried deep, the faint memory of two men who, for one moment in the coldest winter of the war, reminded the world that even in humanity's darkest hour, compassion could still draw breath.